Welcome to Colonie TV, the governmental educational channel for the town of Colonie.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round again, the years keep rolling by.
Welcome. This is Story by Story, sharing the human experience. I'm Kate Dudding. My co-host, Joe Doolittle, is unable to be with us today. But that's fine because we have this fabulous storyteller who has these what I think of as her signature stories. Stories that I've heard, I think I've known our teller 15 years. And so I always enjoy hearing these stories again because I think they're so wonderful. So let's go right in and meet our guest, Betty McCanty from Saratoga Springs.
Hi, Kate.
Welcome, Betty. I'm so glad to have you back again.
Oh, thank you.
Now, did you come from an Irish Catholic family?
Oh, yes.
Yes.
On both sides of the house.
Yes.
Yes,
And
indeed.
so was storytelling part of your what you experienced as a child among your
Well, not in my own house, but when we went to wakes and weddings, everybody was a storyteller, and they were always waiting for the chance to get their foot in so they could tell their story. So, yes, there was part of it, but my mother and father were very hardworking people and very serious, and that was not part of our household.
So how did you become a storyteller?
Well, I got into it by accident. I wanted to go up to Sagamore Institute, and because I'd heard it was a wonderful place, and they were going to have a class called Using Humor in Your Classroom. And I thought, oh, that would be classy. I'd like to do that. So I sent in my money, and they got a letter back saying, well, we're sorry that we're not going to teach that the week you want to come, but we're teaching storytelling instead. And I said, I never heard of that. I don't have any idea what that means. How do you teach storytelling? Well, just send my check back. When they said, well, if you think you'd like humor in the classroom, you'd love storytelling. And so by the grace of God, I said, okay, I'll come. And when I got there, I had a roommate assigned to me, Susan Fandel Spivak, and I said, did you ever hear storytelling? Oh, yes, she said. I do it all the time. And I said, you know some stories? Yes. How many? 250, she said. And I thought I was going to die. I said, I am in the wrong place. This cannot be. But I stuck it out, and at the end of the week, I was hooked. And I've just enjoyed it ever since.
So did you use it in your classroom? Now, you taught French and Latin?
Well, yeah, and no, I think that I found ways of being funny because that was natural. But no, I didn't tell any stories in my classroom.
Okay, so where have you been telling your stories?
Well, fortunately, I was welcomed into the story circle of the Capital District and told stories there. And then people invited me to club meetings and scout dinners. I ate a lot of dinners with the Cub Scouts, and I have some wonderful stories about that, too. And gradually, people around heard that I liked to tell. I was mostly telling folk tales at that time, and so that's what I was invited to do, and that's what I did. Then later, as I got older, and my audiences were older, I found out that they like to hear the things that happened to me in my real life, my own stories. And so that's what I've been concentrating on mostly now.
And since you celebrated your 90th birthday last year, you have quite a bit of material to choose from.
Oh, yes. And the fact is, I also have 8 children. And that does not hurt when you're looking for material either, because and that frightens the daylights out of my kids if they're in the audience. They're so afraid that I'm going to choose just the wrong story.
Now, what about your grandsons? Do they have that fear, or what do they think of your story?
I have 10 grandsons, no granddaughters. And my grandsons love it, and they love it when I mention their names in the story. It's a different feeling they have. They're not going to be judged by me. They're going to be themselves. My own children really thought that their peers were going to make sport of them if they were mentioned. So it's an entirely different feeling, and I love to tell stories to those grandsons. They're very receptive.
Oh, good. Oh, good. Sometimes storytellers are not appreciated in their own home.
Yeah, well, that's really the case. That is the truth.
Yeah, the best thing I've ever had from my son is, I think, not bad. Though he knows that push is a button of mine, and even though he's almost 29, he still enjoys pushing my buttons. And I'm still very slow at going, oh, he's pushing my buttons.
Yeah.
Do not react.
One more time.
One more time. So, would you tell us a story, Betty?
Oh, I certainly would, and I'm so glad you asked. And this is actually a true story. When I was about 10, I lived in Buffalo with my mother and father and my younger brother. And one year it was exceptionally cold, like this winter that we've just had, really, just same kind of winter. And one morning, my Aunt Nanny came running in the front door, came through the living room, through the dining room, into the kitchen, and she had the Courier Express, which was a morning paper. I don't think they have those anymore. May, look at this. It says here in the paper that Niagara Falls has frozen over completely. My mother said, oh, that's got to be some kind of a joke. All those thousands of gallons of water couldn't happen. But here it is. It's in the Courier Express, and there are pictures. And they show the policemen are out on the brink of the falls, directing traffic on the falls. Oh, my mother said, I can't believe it. My aunt said, you know, this is a historic event. I ought to take Betty down there. It might not happen again in our lives, may not happen again in her life. And we ought to go down and see that. And to my astonishment, my mother agreed. And so we went up to Main Street and got the high speed. Now the high speed was a little 2-car train that in the city ran right down the trolley tracks, right through the middle of the street. And when it got out in the country, it went right down through the fields. And every time it crossed a street, a highway, a path, any kind of a byway, the high speed had the right of way. And I bet we were hurtling along at 42 miles an hour.
Whoa.
And the cars would stop. People would get out of their cars and stand there to watch the high speed, and they would wave. And of course, I thought they were waving at me, so I waved back, and I just was having a wonderful time. Now, when we got down to the falls, usually, the noise of the falls would deafen you. But that day it was absolutely still. Not a sound coming from the river. There was ice everywhere. And as we went down the path, we began to hear the crunch of the ice under our feet. And there was ice on the wires, on all the metal signs, on the benches along the way. Every little twig that everything was covered with ice, and the sun was shining. It made it look as if you were walking into a crystal palace. And when we got down to the brink of the river, there we looked down, there were 2 lines of people right along the brink of the falls, and then a third line of policemen with their back to the brink, and they were holding those yellow crime scene tapes so that people wouldn't actually fall right over the front of the falls. And everybody was in a holiday mood. They were waving and talking to utter strangers. So I thought my aunt would probably say, well, Bets, we'll just stand here and watch. But to my utter amazement, she said, come on, Bets, let's go. And we went over, and down the brink of the river we went, and out on the ice. We looked up toward our left, and those huge boulders that usually make the rapids when there's water flowing, they were all encased in thick, thick ice, and it was sort of I think you'd call it a daiquiri color, a pale green, and the sun shining it made it look like tremendous jewels there in the riverbed. And so we started across, and the policemen were standing about every 6 or 8 feet, and I thought it was classy to go up to each one and tell them who I was and where I came from and all that, you know. I was just thinking that I was all important. And they were very polite until we got to the last one over, almost to Goat Island. And that last policeman said, you have to turn around and go back because the ice is breaking up and the water is coming down. Well, my aunt grabbed my hand and we started back, and I was reluctant because I had this idea that the next day in school I could tell kids that I walked across to Goat Island. Well, it was not to be, because my aunt was determined we were going to get back there fast. And we got back there. Now, dozens of people had been down the bank, and it was all clay and ice and water and gunk. And my aunt was a very large lady, and she had one heck of a time getting back up the bank, but she made it. And then we got back to the high speed. But by now, to me, it felt like slow motion, because I couldn't wait to get home and tell my mother what we had done. And when we got home, I took off my woolly hat and my woolly scarf and my mittens and threw them in the living room. Mother, guess what we did? My mother wasn't happy. She was furious. She chased my aunt into the dining room, and she chased her around and around the dining room table. My mother was about as big as my aunt. She'd never admit it. And around they went, and my mother chased my aunt right out into the street. She didn't come back for 3 months. Well, I thought, parents don't know everything. Now, tomorrow in school, we're going to have show and tell. And will I have a story to tell? So I got to school early, and I had my hand all ready to go as soon as the teacher said show and tell. But then, of course, she had to get in all the late library books, and she had to get in the excuse for absence. She had to read what was going to be fed in the cafeteria. Well, she never get to, when is show and tell? Finally, she said, and now we're going to have show and tell. But before we do, I want you children to see what's in this morning's paper, in the Courier Express. There's a picture of these people, these stupid people who risked their lives walking on Niagara Falls. Now, boys and girls, they could all have been killed. I thought, oh, dear God, please don't let anybody recognize me. Don't let them see. I promise I won't hit my brother ever again. Please don't let anybody recognize me. And mercifully, they didn't. And I didn't tell the story for 60 years. I was so ashamed of having done such a stupid thing. But then I was at a conference where you had to get up and tell something dumb that you did. And I couldn't think of anything dumber than I had done. And so I told that. And as I was telling it, I thought, it wasn't the smartest thing I ever did. But on the other hand, there was something noble about it. It's history. And I was there. And now I tell it with some degree of pride.
You daredevil, you.
Oh, yes. Well, I was telling it about, a couple of years ago, and a lady came up to me afterwards, and she said, oh, I wish I heard that story 3 years ago. And I said, really? Why? Well, that's when my Uncle Frank died. And I said, yeah, what about it? And she said, well, he was there that day, and he told that story all his life, and no one ever believed it. And I thought, isn't that sad? So
you were too ashamed to tell it. He was proud to tell it, but no one believed it.
Not of it, not a bit. Well, she said that he was a great kidder.
Okay, well, yeah.
So that
yeah.
probably put them off, you know.
Yes. Oh. Well, but I love the way you bring us to that moment in time, that the high speed, that I never knew there were, I mean, there were trolleys. I knew there were trolleys. Then, though I guess I've only seen trolley tracks and only trolleys in San Francisco. I think those are the only ones I've ever actually seen. But the glistening of every twig covered. I've been to Niagara Falls around Christmas time, and it was at
beautiful.
Night, but there were lots of lights on, and it was like, as you said, a crystal palace.
Oh, it's unforgettable.
Mm-hmm.
That image just stays with you forever.
Mm-hmm. That it's that mist is. It just spreads, and when it hits something cold like a tree,
it hangs on.
It hangs on, yeah. So that's something.
Well, I'm glad you've had the experience because it's something that you try to explain, but seeing it is much better.
Yes, yes. And then calling the frozen water the color of a daiquiri. That after I heard you tell this story the first time, I went to Niagara Falls, and I was on the Canadian side where you can get quite close to the brink.
Yeah.
And yes, indeed, the water is that pale green color.
Yeah.
Maybe the color of lime juice, daiquiri. Okay, that all fits together, right?
Now, I have to tell you, the Canadian side did not freeze.
Right. Well, that I think has more water going on.
Well, yes. And this year, when there was, they thought that that the American side was completely frozen. Mm-hmm. That was true, but the Canadian side, there's much more water, and it forms a horseshoe shape, and that is much more difficult. Mm-hmm. So that's never frozen over. So I don't want anybody to think that I'm complaining that the whole falls.
Right.
Let the record show.
Yes, but they didn't allow people to walk over the top of the American Falls, did they, this year?
I don't think so.
Yeah.
There were people there waiting, but there was one place over near Goat Island again, and the water was continuing to flow over there, and that was way too dangerous.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they were spared that shame.
Yes. Oh, yes. That's and the show and tell and the agony of waiting. I mean, you really brought us to all these different places, and though I've never seen two large women running around a dining table, that was amusing to imagine in my head.
Unforgettable. It brings to mind hippopotami.
She means it in the most loving way, I'm sure.
Sorry.
Oh. So you've had that reaction to your story. Have you had other reactions? What do your grandsons say about you doing something like that? Did they ever say anything?
Oh, they think it's wonderful. And of course, my children don't want any part of it because they would share in the shame that was involved. But the grandsons, they love to hear the story. Mm-hmm. And I have a little great-granddaughter who knows how to operate Skype. And thanks to you, there's a way of getting that story on Skype.
Yeah.
And so she loves to, and if her mother says, "What are you doing?" she says, "I'm getting grandma'd." And she loves to hear it. So I think in that generation, if I last long enough, I'll be able to tell them lots of stories because they're far enough away that there'll be no shame accruing to them at all.
Just great pride.
Just the joy of hearing a good story. And there is a certain joy in hearing a story well told that I don't know anything else that can quite match it, because there's a personal involvement not only with the teller but with the listener too, and so there's a spark there that goes back and forth that's as electric as anything I know of, and I'm so grateful for my audiences because they contribute so much to the telling. Although one time I was telling and there was a woman there in the front row and her eyes were closed closed, and she didn't move a muscle through the whole telling. And I told probably for about an hour, and she didn't open her eyes. She just stayed still. And so I couldn't wait till it was over, and I went over to her and I said, "Oh, I'm Betty, and I was telling those stories." And she said, "I know." And I said, "But you weren't listening." "Oh, yes, I was," she said. "I didn't want anything else to get in the way of those stories. And so I closed my eyes so nothing else would get in the way, and I tried to close my ears to other things." And she said, "I just wanted to be alone with the stories." And I thought, well, that was some kind of a different reaction. I was so glad to know that she wasn't either asleep or otherwise engaged.
Yeah, totally uninterested. I mean, yes. Yeah.
And there was another experience that I had. A lady came in, and she was in a walker, and she had a beautiful yellow dress on and a hat, although it was right in the residence where she lived, hat and gloves and pocketbook. And she came and she sat, and she didn't take her eyes off me. She listened and listened and listened. And at the end I said, "I'm so glad that you came, and I'm glad you enjoyed the story." "Oh," she said, "I'm stone deaf and I didn't hear a word you said." But she got the facial expressions, I guess, was enough.
You never quite know.
No, you don't. Your audience brings you so many different reactions, so many different emotions, and lots of times they want to tell you their own story immediately after.
Right.
And I have 2 or 3 very, very good stories that people have given me just standing at the mic afterwards, you know, and being willing to share their own life with me. I think that's quite a gift. I always say, thank you very much.
Yes, yes. Yes, I got a story like that when I was just a beginner teller, and I was at a storytelling event, and another member of the audience and I afterwards were, you know, eating our cookies and punch and drinking our punch, and she told me a story. And it was about her family having to leave Egypt once the state of Israel was created, because all Jews in Egypt lost their work permits. And that's how they were evicted from Egypt, because how can you stay without any work? So it wasn't until later I went, oh, I really want to share that story. I have no idea who this woman is. It was in New York City, so it wasn't even local. So I didn't have a prayer of finding her, but I tell it as faithfully as I can.
That's all you need to do. That you're not required to go and find her, but just if you give her credit and say that you are indebted to her, that's all. That's all you need to do.
Yeah, that I realized that this was a moment in history seen from the personal perspective, and that's really the only way I can understand history. That 2 million Jews in Egypt lost their work permits. It's hard for me to grasp onto that. But her family's experience and the fact that each adult could only take 2 suitcases, and they could only take out the amount of money you'd need for like a month's vacation.
Wow.
So it was very stringently regulated. They're kicking them out. I mean, really hard. And so her family managed to smuggle out some money, and that's what the story's all about. Not that she knew that what they were doing until they were already safely in France. But to me, that's a story gives me insight into all refugee stories. That if I hear somebody left another country for another historical reason and only could carry, had what they had in their own hands, I hark back to her story, and I get a feeling of their desperation. And they bought new clothes because that was not regulated. They bought fabulous new clothes, and they wore them and they packed them, even though they knew that as soon as they got to France, they would be selling them. That was another way they They were trying to get some of it surviving. Yeah.
And that feeling that you have from that story comes through in every similar story that you'll ever tell. It'll be an extra color in the story, an extra depth into the story. How lucky.
Yes.
You know, it seems like happenstance, but it's so
Right.
important for a storyteller.
Right. Yeah, because I don't remember what the actual program that day,
Isn't that great? Yeah.
which
the
might have been more of a
important-
lecture, but the story has remained with me.
And the emotion.
Yes.
Absolutely,
Yes.
absolutely wonderful.
Yes. So. Okay, let's see how we're doing on time. We're doing wonderfully on time. So why don't you tell us another story, and then I'll do my what's happening in storytelling in April break,
Okay.
and then we'll go back for your final one. Oh, good. So
Well, this story was given to me by Ruth Debelius, who was the secretary at the school where I was teaching. And she had gotten the story from her boss, the principal of the school, who always said that he was going to write it up and send it to a magazine or something, because he had heard it at the Lions Club or someplace in Ballston Spa. But he didn't do that, and Ruth had no intention of doing it. So she gave me the story, so I'm indebted to her for that. Oh, it was so hot. Oh, it was one of those weeks in the summer when it gets up to 90 and doesn't quit. It was just unbearably hot all day long and into the night. And the little boys in Ballston Spa had just about run out of things that they could do. They were a bunch of them were standing under a tree, and their bicycles were on the ground, and their knickers were unbuttoned, and their shirts were hanging open. And they, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? And one of them said, I've got an idea. Let's go down to the Cateros and go skinny dipping. Said Art, you can't do that. Somebody will see us. Oh, if we go down and walk along the creek till it goes around that bend, nobody's going to walk that far on a day like this. We'll be perfectly safe. Nobody will see us. So they took their bikes and down Blizzardorf's Hill they went, up to the creek, turned right at the creek and went around till it formed that circle around. Oh, would you believe? The Cateros was almost dry. Only mud puddles here and there. Art said, you can't go skinny dipping in a mud puddle. No, we couldn't. What are we going to do now? Well, Red said, let's go up and sit on our veranda. At least it'll be shady up there. So they took their bikes and they trudged up Blizzardorf's Hill. Oh, that's a tough one to do, walk all the way up there. They went over to Gardner's house and they sat on the veranda. Now, Mrs. Gardner knew they were coming, so she was out in the kitchen and she took her cut glass pitcher, nice big pitcher. She went out on the back porch where the ice box was, and she took the ice pick off the nail, and she went over and she opened the compartment where the block of ice was, and she chunked off a nice big piece of ice, and she took that and put it in the cut glass pitcher. Then she picked up all the shards that were on there and put those in the pitcher too. And she went back out in the kitchen and she got a lemon reamer, and she reamed those lemons, got every last bit of drop that she could, and she put the juice in the pitcher, and then she put 2 of the or lemon rinds in for added flavor. She put a whole lot of sugar in and ice cold water. Then she put that on the tray with the glasses, started down the long hall. The boys could hear her coming because they could hear the clink of that ice on the pitcher, and they were ready. And so she poured a nice big glass for each one of them, and they took their glass. Oh, it was cold. Oh, it felt wonderful. Oh, it was cold. And then they took a sip, and it was tart, and it was sweet, and it went all the way down. Oh, they made it last just as long as they could. They took tiny, tiny sips. Oh, and it was wonderful. But everything comes to an end, and that did too. Now what are we going to do? They had run about through everything they could think of to do. But Hank said, I have a really good idea. Let's go up in the north end and climb up in the water tower and go in there and have a swim in the water tower. Oh, you can't do that, the fellow said. You can't. There are signs all over. Danger, keep out. This means you. No entrance. You can't do that. Oh, who's going to be out to look at? Well, then besides that, we have to cross the Blue Mill Bridge. And you know those North End toughs are just waiting for some kids from the South End. Oh, they'll destroy us. As dumb as they are, do you think that they're going to be standing out there? There isn't a bit of shade for blocks around. Come on, let's go. Get your bicycles and let's go. So down they went, down Milton Avenue, across the Blue Mill Bridge, not a soul there. They went up as far as they could up in the north end. They dropped the bicycles, and there was the fence with all the signs. This means you. But they paid no attention. Over the fence, up the ladder on the front, and around the catwalk, and up the ladder on the back, and into the water. Oh, cool water on their hot bodies. They started to splash themselves. Then they splashed each other. Then they had all kinds of races to see who could last the longest underwater, who could float, all kinds of things. They were having a wonderful time. I was just enjoying themselves. And meanwhile, they had no conception of time. But 3:30 was a magic hour down on the flats in Ballston Spa, where all the people were working in that beastly hot, waiting for the closing hour. 3:30 was the magic hour. All the people working down there were waiting, watching the clock, waiting for 3:30. Now, down in the sock mill, people didn't have any air conditioning, of course, no fans. And if you opened the window, that only made the woolen lint come through the air and go down in the cuffs of the workers and down in the collars. And it was itchy and hot. And they'd say, close that window. There was no chance of getting a breath of fresh air there. And everybody's waiting for the closing hour. Down in the factory where they made the gloves, the women were pushing that heavy hide through those sewing machines with their hands, and the hides had been dyed, and the dye was coming off on their hands, and as they moved the sweat off their brow and off their face, the dye was coming off too, and they looked like circus clowns, and they felt terrible, but they couldn't go in and wash off or wash their face or their hands because they only got paid for each piece that went through those sewing machines. And if you didn't put a piece through, you didn't get paid at that point. So you kept working, and your eyes would dart up to see the clock. How many minutes more till it was 3:30? But the worst of all was down at the tannery, because down in the tannery they had these beds in the floor, and the beds were full of water with chemicals. And then they would put the hides with the hair still on them right in that mixture in those tubs down there. And the smell was absolutely disgusting. It was bad enough in the wintertime, but under the conditions of all that heat for day after day after day, it was revolting. And the men kept saying, oh, I can't wait to get home and get in a tub or put my head in the sink and get washed up. Oh, I can't wait. It's 18 minutes till it's 3:30. They all knew exactly what time it was. And finally, merciful heavens, it was 3:30, and the workers poured into the streets of Ballston Spa, and they all walked home, thinking, I can't wait. When they got there, they turned on the faucets and the taps and the spigots, and they filled up the tub and the basin and the sink, and there was a sudden demand for water. And that's what the water tower was all about. It was there to provide water for a sudden need. And so the water began to come out into the pipe and away from the water tower. And at first the boys up in the tower didn't notice. They were having such a great time. They didn't notice that the water was going out. And Art said, "Look at me, I've learned to float on my back, and he's pointing up at the top, and the boys looked, and there was the top of the tower, and there they were. Oh, they panicked. They began to shout and carry on and jump, trying to jump, reaching. And of course they couldn't reach that high. And finally one of them said, "Now wait a minute, we've got to get organized here. We've got to go, one fellow stand down on the bottom, another on his shoulders, and another on his shoulders, and make a human ladder, and the last guy up will go over the top and go down to the Union Fire Company. There's sure to be somebody down there that'll help." So Frank Hart, one of those guys, I guess it was Hank. He was a big, strong fellow, and he said, "I'll go down first, and you fellas climb up as fast as you can." But the truth of the matter was, there was a lot of water gone from the tank, but there was a lot of water still on the bottom, and the fellow in the bottom was going to be underwater and would have to hold his breath for quite a while. So Hank went down with his mighty breath of air, and the fellas just scrambled, and they fell off, and finally he had to come up. Could not hold his breath another second. And Art said, "Let me try." And they said, "You're too small. You can't do it, but let me try." So Art went down, and the boys scrambled again, and Art had to come up. He couldn't hold his breath either. Then Steve said, "Now I want to try." Now Steve wasn't really a member of the gang. His folks had just come over from the old country, and they talked funny, and they wore funny clothes, and their food smelled kind of funny too. But Steve was strong, and he knew how to do things too. He said, "Now, you have to be ready. You have to be in line. 1, 2, 3, 4. Fast. No scramble, no scramble. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, we're ready." So Steve went down, and the boys went up 1, 2, 3, 4, and the last one could almost reach the top. And he said, "Come on, fellas, stretch." And they all stretched as much as they could, and he grabbed the top of that and pulled himself up and over, and down he went, down the ladder and around the catwalk, down the ladder, over the fence, pulled on a pair of pants. Then he picked up any old bicycle, went down the hill, down as far as the Union Fire Company. Now, some of the Whalen fellas were down there, and some of the Thomas boys were there. And when they heard the story, they put the ladder on the rig and got the horse and put the horse on the rig, and away they went up as far as they could go. Then they took the ladder off, went up the ladder, around the catwalk, up the other ladder, and put their ladder down into the water and saved the boys. Now, it's entirely possible that sometime when it was awfully hot, the boys might have decided to go for another swim. But if they did, you can bet your boots that they watched that water level as if their lives depended on it.
Oh, Betty, again, you took us back in time, but so subtly. That
Like a truck.
No, you didn't say, "Well, in about 1932, in August." No, the first inclination of the time period that I picked up and wrote down were knickers. I'm going, "Oh, okay, this is a while ago." And the veranda, and of course the icebox that
every house had.
Right, and I never thought of the ice pick had to be near the icebox,
Oh, yeah.
so there would be a designated nail for it, or
Absolutely.
a place for it. Yes. And then the factories. Now, when you were given this story, was all that information about the factories in it, or?
No, but I lived in Ballston Spa, and I knew about the conditions in the factories, and especially in the tannery. That was a hard place to work because the conditions were very bad for the workers. And no, I put that in. And also, I talked to Chris Morley, whose name really was Morris, but he was called Chris Morley. Incidentally, he just died a couple of weeks ago. He was a preeminent natural storyteller. You give him a word and you'd get a story. And so I went to him and I said, can you tell me the names of some of the people who might have been there at the time? And so he said, now you have to understand, they were a good 10 years older than I. They weren't friends of mine or anything, but he gave, and he said, and the Whalens and the Thomases always were in the Union Fire Company. Ballston Spa, small as it is, used to have 3 fire companies, and it still does have 2, and they're very much in competition. But the North Enders were very loyal to the Union Fire Company, and they were always willing to help anybody that had any kind of a problem. And I'm sure that there was no thought in their mind of hesitating to rescue those boys, that they would be really ready and able to do that. So I'm indebted also to Chris for that help.
Yes, and the human ladder, I mean, it was, I guess I've seen acrobats do 3 on TV, but yes, and they're desperate. I really like that story.
I am so glad, because it is truly my story now.
Yes, yes, indeed. So, well, let's get on to the coming attractions, and then we'll get back for your last story. So, on April 1st, that's the first Tuesday of the month, there's a new open mic series in Schenectady that Joe Doolittle is hosting. It's First Tuesdays, Tales and Stuff. Open mic for storytelling, music, and the spoken word. And Sandy Schumann will be there talking about Adirondack Fools. He's written a book about he's taken the Helm stories, which are traditional Jewish stories about a village somewhere that is full of fools. He's transported them to the Adirondacks and merged in some of the Adirondacks' tall tales. Because there is a place called Helms Pond, Helms, and he said over time the sea has been lost, or So what a perfect event to have on the night of April Fools, to hear about Adirondack Fools. And so that's at Arthur's Market and Historic Coffee House. That's now open again, right where the Statue of Lawrence is in the stockade. 7 to 9. If you want to sign up, come at 6:45. The slots are recommended to be 10 minutes long. And it's free, but there will be a collection taken for the featured teller. Now, another wonderful event is Sunday, April 6th at 2 o'clock at the GE Theater in Proctor's. That's when a film is going to be shown, an award-winning film called Stepping Toward the Lion, Finding My Story. It's about one man's journey through Children at the Well, Youth Stories for Peace and Understanding, which is a very unique storytelling group in this area. This young man, Alauddin Umar, is Muslim, and when he went to a public high school, he got bullied for being a Muslim. But when he joined Children at the Well, he met other teens from many other religions, and he was very welcomed. And it helped him, his experience there helped him find his way. So it's a wonderful movie. It's 30 minutes long, created by John Lydon from Rensselaer, and this film won he was the winner of the Best Student Film at the recent Peace on Earth Film Festival in Chicago. So everyone who's been involved in it is thrilled that this happened, that John has received this recognition. So the film will be shown at 2, and then there will be a discussion. John, the director and executive producer, will be there. Alauddin will be there. Gert Johnson, who heads the parent organization for Children at the Well, will lead the discussion. So it's really an event that you should attend. This film is excellent, and Children at the Well is a wonderful organization. And their website is, as you can see, childrenatthewell.org. I'm their volunteer webmaster. So later that week, up in where Betty lives in Saratoga, Wednesday, April 9th, 7 to 9, will be the Saratoga Storytelling Open Mic at Woodlawn Commons in the Harkness Building, part of the Wesley community. It's behind Hospice. To me, that's the best way to find it. I think it has the addresses on Lawrence Street, but you don't go in on Lawrence Street, so. Find the directions for Hospice, and it's the pretty big building right behind it on the circle. The next story circle meeting, Betty mentioned being a member of it. That's how we met. And at Janine Laverty's storytelling weekends up in the Adirondacks. The next story circle meeting will be Wednesday, April 16th at the Pine Hills branch of the Albany Public Library. The purpose is to share stories on development, only telling, no reading, please. And then there are 2 events that end April and then go into May, again about children at the well. The annual Youth Story Circle, led by the Children at the Well Storytellers on Wednesday, April 30th, starting at 6:30. That's free, and it's hosted by the Congregation Beth Emeth on Academy Road in Albany. This is one of the monthly meetings of the Interfaith Story Circle of the Tri-City area. And then the following Sunday, the following Sunday, May 4th at 2 o'clock at St. Paul's Church in Troy will be an afternoon of storytelling from many traditions with a musical interlude. Again, Children at the Well tellers, and there's an optional vegetarian potluck supper that follows the performance. Both of those things are wonderful. I go every year. And there's a suggested donation because Children at the Well, they have a number of coaches, they have expenses. There's tuition for each of the students, but the tuition doesn't cover the whole cost of the program. So I recommend that you go to all of those, and if you can't, you can go to our website, storycircle@proctors.org, and look at over 100 stories that are on YouTube, mostly collected from this very program. So Betty, we have 11 and a half minutes left. Do you have an 11-minute story for us?
I think so. If it runs over, they'll just have to go down and find it on YouTube. Well, I better get started then.
Yes.
When I was little, baseball was big in Buffalo, and my family was really into baseball. And at night, my father and my mother and I used to sit around the kitchen table. We had a little Philco radio, and it stayed always on the kitchen table. And we would listen to the play-by-play of the Buffalo Bisons down at Offerman Stadium. On Sunday, my father and I would walk over to Delaware Park to watch the softball games. And he would tell me all the fine points of the game, and then afterwards, he'd buy me an Eskimo pie. And really, to this day, I love Eskimo pies. But the best thing of all, on Wednesday night, when the Bisons were home at Offerman Stadium, it was ladies' night, and my mother and I could go in for 15 cents. So we could take the trolley down to the Offerman Stadium, and if we got our peanuts outside, they were 5 cents a bag. If you waited till you got through the gate, they were 10 cents. So you can imagine my mother always made sure we got our peanuts outside. And she'd always tell me, we don't have to buy a program, because after all, we know the names and the numbers of all the players. And we don't know how to keep a box score anyway. So no problem, we didn't get a program. Now, we each had a favorite. My mother's favorite was Ollie Carnegie. I think he was a catcher. He was built like Babe Ruth, kind of heavy set. And when he connected with a ball, it went a country mile. But my favorite was a young rookie, brand new to the Bisons. His name was Lou Boudreau. Lou was tall and dark, and I thought the handsomest man that ever lived. But besides being a good player, he was so kind. He always acknowledged the crowd. He'd sign an autograph for anybody that asked. He was just a very, very kind man, and I was just agog about Lou Boudreau. The second year that he signed on as a rookie, wonder of wonder, miracle of miracles. Lou Boudreau and his wife and new baby rented the house right next door. Oh, I couldn't believe it. Every day I would be standing, just sort of nonchalantly standing on the front lawn when it was time for Lou to go down to the trolley, to get the trolley to go to Offerman Stadium. And he'd be carrying his favorite bat and glove. And he would tip his hat and he'd say, "Well, hello there, Missy. How are you today?" How was I? I was halfway to heaven. Well, in the part of Buffalo where we lived, the houses were too close together to admit a driveway. And so the Boudreau's kitchen was only about 10 feet from our dining room. And in those days, of course, no air conditioning and nobody had a fan. But nobody closed their windows all summer long. And so the Boudreau's kitchen windows were open and our dining room windows were open. And when the Bisons were home, and it wasn't a Wednesday night, I would figure out what time Lou would be coming home, and I would crawl out of my bed, and on my hands and knees, I would crawl out into the dining room, up against the windows, high enough that my ear was high, but not too high. And I would just listen. And they would talk, he and Mrs. Boudreau, while they ate a little light supper, they would tell about the things that the baby did that day, and they would talk about who was getting traded, who was getting married, who was going to have a baby. Nothing personal. And I never told anybody anything that they said. I just loved being part of their life. It was an enchanted time for me. I just felt as if I fell into heaven. Until one night, something woke my father. My father got up, came down the hall into the dining room, flicked on a big overhead light. He was wearing his long johns. Looked down and he saw me. "Betty, what the hell are you doing?" Oh, I couldn't speak. I looked at his feet, and I knew that Mrs. Boudreau knew exactly what I was doing. So I slithered back to my bed. Well, I never again eavesdropped on anybody, and I never again stood out on the front lawn waiting for Lou to go down and get the trolley to go down to the field. But I never lost track of his career, and he had a wonderful career. He stayed in Buffalo for a couple of years, and then he went up to the majors, and he worked for the Cleveland Indians at Lakefront Stadium. And my father and I, and my mother also, went up, or I guess west to Cleveland many times to see him play. After a while, he became general manager of the Indians, and the sports pages were full of it because he was the youngest one who had ever been raised to general manager of a major league team. And he had a great career, and no scandal was ever applied to him. He always stayed married to Mrs. Boudreau. He was well known for being a really honest, good manager, and he was elected to the Baseball Hall of Fame. And my daughter and her 3 children and I went down to Cooperstown so that we could see his picture and his favorite bat, his favorite glove, and a rundown of all the remarkable things that had happened in his career. And Lou lived to a couple of years ago, and when my grandson was in college. And Michael, my grandson, sent me a sympathy card, and on it he wrote, "It's hard to lose a hero." And yes, Michael, it's very hard to lose a hero. Did we make it through the time?
Yes, we have 4 minutes left.
Oh.
Yes, yes. What did you skip? No.
Well, I was a little nervous about the time, and so I hurried through, and I don't think I skipped anything, but I certainly talked with both ends of my tongue. I have a joke I could tell you.
Well, let me talk about the story for just a little bit. And then a joke, 3 stories, and a joke from Betty McCanty. Woo! Oh, You slithered. You poor little thing.
I felt like a real snake. I really did. Oh, dear
And
God.
too embarrassed to even meet their eyes again because they must have heard your father's outburst.
Oh, they heard it all over the neighborhood. I think he probably thought that there was an intruder or something, and he was frightened.
And you were on the floor, and
Yeah.
maybe you had been injured, or
Yeah, well, all kinds of emotions came into that. He wasn't quiet about it.
Oh. Well, Betty, you've given us quite a look into just two parts of your life, and then your knowledge of Ballston Spa fed into your other story. And you do have a way with words and capturing the situation and sparking our imagination. So.
Well, they opened a whole world to me that I have just loved being part of.
And so, and the teacher up at Sagamore was
Janine Laverty, who is my mentor to this day and has given me all kinds of new ways of looking at stories and new ways of telling them. And I'm deeply indebted.
Yeah, Janine has taught many of the storytellers in the area, including myself, that we're all indebted to. And that's why she won the Northeast Region's Award for Service and Leadership in 1990 from the National Storytelling Network.
Yes. We all wrote notes to be included in that.
Yeah, including Joe Bruchac.
Yes.
Yes. So Betty, you have a joke to finish up our
Yes, I do.
time together?
Oh, the old guy went to the doctor, and he was all bent over, and he was kvetching, and he was complaining about this and that. Everything was wrong, and the doctor gave him a thorough examination and talked to him, and finally the old guy left. Well, about a month later, the doctor was walking down Broadway, and he saw the old guy coming, and he wasn't all bent over. He was standing up straight, had a classy new hat, new set of clothes, beautiful woman on his arm, and a smile all over his face. And the doctor said, "Boy, am I glad to see you." "Well, I'm glad to see you, Doc. I want to say thank you." "Thank you for what?" "For what you told me." "What did I tell you?" "Well, you told me that I should get a hot mama and be cheerful." And the doctor thinks to himself, and he said, "I wonder if I should tell him that what I really said was, you have a heart murmur and you better be careful."
And on that note, I think we will say goodbye for today. So I guess we learned from that listen to what your doctor says and take the best possible interpretation of it. So thanks to all of you for joining us at Story by Story, sharing the human experience. We hope you'll come to some live storytelling events, or at least visit us on YouTube, or come back next month for our next show. Thank you very much.
It goes all my life's a circle, sunrise and sundown. The moon rolls through the nighttime till the daybreak comes around. And all my life's a circle, I can't tell you why. Seasons spinning round